Hello. Today I want to introduce you to the idea of politics as a game of strategy. Politics is a complex, high-stakes game. So the study of politics, whatever else it might be, is also the study of high-stakes games. Now, when I say that politics is a complex game, in reality, a series of complex games, some of which are nested inside each other, I don't mean to say that politics is necessarily fun or that there are always winners and losers, although both these are sometimes true. What distinguishes a complex game like chess from a simple game like solitaire is that it's interactive and therefore there's a lot more strategy. Interactive here means that one player's actions influence the other player's actions. A strategy here is a plan of action that each player has developed in order to secure a desired outcome. So a strategy, for example, can say, if you do X, I should do Y. But if you do Y, I should probably do X. Have any of you ever watched the movie The Princess Bride? In it, there's a scene where the main character, Wesley, played by Cary Elwes, plays a game with a villain, Vizzini, played by Sean Wallace. Vizzini has to guess which of two glasses of wine Wesley has poisoned. So he starts to reason. If you think I'm stupid, you'll give me the wine you poisoned. But you know I'm not stupid. So knowing that you'll give me the non-poisoned wine, you'll give me the non-poisoned wine. So that I'll switch glasses with you and take the poisoned wine, which you set in front of yourself. But you know that I know that, so maybe you give me the poisoned wine. And so on and so forth. Eventually, Vizzini makes his decision and ends up keeling over dead. Of course, what Vizzini didn't know is that Wesley had been secretly building up a tolerance to the poison for years. So in fact, both glasses were poisoned. This highlights one of the important lessons that you can learn from games of strategy. If you're going to take advantage of your knowledge in games of strategy, you need to know which game you are playing. And so this brings us to real-world debates and the debates going on in Congress over whether to raise the debt ceiling. A lot of people in the past few years have been modeling debates over the debt ceiling as a game of chicken. Are you familiar with the game of chicken? It was popular among rebellious teens in the 1950s and immortalized in James Dean movies like Rebel Without a Cause. Though, of course, chicken was always a lot more popular in movies about teenagers in the 1950s than with actual teenagers. In one classic version of the game, two players speed towards each other in cars at a constant speed. The player who swerves first is the chicken. Now, chicken is pretty easy to figure out as a game. Think about it. If I swerve and you don't, then I'm the chicken and you win. If the opposite happens, that is to say, you swerve and I keep going straight, then you're the chicken and I win. If we both swerve, well, that's better than losing, but it's not as good as winning. And if we both stay straight, well, then we're both dead. And that's the worst of all possible outcomes. We can describe these payoffs or these possible outcomes in something called a payoff matrix. So here's the payoff matrix for a game of chicken. You see that we have two players, Rebel 1 and Rebel 2. Each has two options, swerve or go straight, which means that there's four possible outcomes to this game. And in this payoff matrix, I've simply put the payoffs to each player in the box, right? So if it's swerve, swerve, for example, which is the top left corner, both veer off and don't crash into one another, then each player gets their second best choice. They're chickens. They would have preferred to be to go straight and be macho, but neither died, and that's better than all but one of the other outcomes. Now, the best outcome for player 1 is that player 1 goes straight and the other swerves. And in a perfectly mirrored fashion, the best outcome for rebel number 2 is that he goes straight and the other chicken's out. And of course, in the bottom right-hand corner, we have the worst outcome for both players, which is both run straight into one another and both die. Okay, so what strategy should I adopt when playing chicken? Well, if I think you're going to chicken out, then I should go full speed ahead. But if I think that you're going to go full speed ahead, well, it's better to be a chicken than to end up dead. So the best strategy in the game of chicken is doing the opposite of what the other player does. And it depends crucially on what the other player does. That's why it's interactive. So what does fighting over the debt ceiling have to do with a game like chicken? Well, a lot, I think, actually. Let me explain a little bit what the fight over the debt ceiling is about first. Our tax revenue these days doesn't cover government expenditures every year. This is called a budget deficit. So less money is coming in than is going out. To fill up the missing money, the government has to borrow, either from itself or from the private sector. It borrows itself by issuing IOUs to, say, the Treasury or to the Federal Reserve. It borrows from the private sector by simply going out and asking and printing government bonds. Now, debt is problematic for many reasons that we can't really go into here. But all we have to know is that there is a law in place about how much debt the government is allowed to take on. It's a kind of credit limit, right? Like you have on your credit card. And when the government gets close to its credit limit, it has to apply to raise its credit limit, which is the debt ceiling, the maximum amount of debt that the government can take out. The problem recently for the United States has been that we have spending commitments that are rising over time. They structurally just rise because as the population ages, the ratio of older people to younger people therefore is rising. Medicare, Social Security, and other expenditures that are primarily targeted at the old tend to rise naturally, and these are large parts of our budget. President Obama wants to keep funding the rising costs of entitlement programs like Medicare and Social Security. Republicans in Congress want to cut these programs, probably so that we can keep taxes low. Both Congress and the president are needed to pass a budget. Congress has to pass the budget, and the president has to sign it. And I'm going to ignore the presence of the Senate here for simplicity's sake, because spending bills have to start in Congress, and so that's where most of the action is going to be. By the current rules of the debt ceiling, unless Congress passes a bill to authorize the government to borrow more money to fund its spending programs, the president gets to decide which agencies will shut down because the government is no longer paying the costs of running them. So there's a deadline when new money is going to be needed to pay for the government. Deadline is when the government runs out and hits its credit limit. Congress and the president are speeding towards this deadline like two teenagers in 1957 Thunderbirds. At any time, either can swerve. That is to say, they can offer to back down and let the other one have their way. But if they do, everyone's going to see that they chickened out. The side that didn't chicken out is going to claim victory, and the side that did chicken out will have to face irate or demoralized constituents and voters, not to mention deal with a budget outcome which they hate. So, just like the payoff matrix that we saw above, we can create a payoff matrix for President Obama and the Republicans in Congress. For Obama, the best outcome is that Republicans chicken out and the debt ceiling is raised. Later on, taxes, of course, will have to increase to pay back the debt. For Congress, controlled by Republicans, the best outcome is that Obama chickens out, and he signs a bill cutting increases in future spending. Now, both outcomes solve the problem. That is to say, they move us away from the debt ceiling, and they enable us to fund the current activities of government, but they solve the problem in very different ways. Another option is, of course, being the chicken while the other side stands firm. In that case, your side loses credibility with your voters, and you get a policy preference, as we mentioned above, that you hate voted into law. Now, if both chicken out, that's okay. It's not as good as a win, but you get a compromise, probably some spending cuts and some modest increases in the debt ceiling. If you both don't compromise, the government comes crashing to a halt and shuts down. And everyone pretty much is mad at you. And that's really bad. So, What should we expect to happen in this budget game of chicken? And what does actually happen? Well, that kind of depends on what you think the payoffs and the strategies of the players are going to be. Is it worse for you as President Obama or as the Republican Party to lose a game of chicken or for the government to shut down? And that kind of depends on what your preferences are, how you see your payoffs. And of course, it also depends on what the American people will think of you, because after all, your power depends on the people. Who will the American people hold responsible for this fiasco, if it does happen? If they're mad enough, the American people could easily blame everyone, vote for new parties, and throw everyone out of office. That would be a real case of the game of chicken where both players ended up dead. In this case, Republicans and Democrats would end up politically dead, not physically dead. Of course, the American people are worse off if the government shuts down. That's the worst outcome for them. But that doesn't mean that that's the worst outcome for the political parties. Something can, after all, be good for the two major political parties and not so good for the American people or the political system as a whole. You might think of lobbying and campaign contributions in this way. As it turns out, I don't think that Republicans and Democrats are that worried that the American people will start voting for alternative new parties. For one, it's really difficult to start up new parties. You have to get lots of different signatures in lots of different places, and that costs a lot of money. Moreover, there really isn't a large pool of politically savvy politicians ready to take over in our current third parties. After all, if they were politically savvy, they would probably moderate their views, at least in public, and join one of the two dominant parties. So, in fact, this is not a real game of chicken. Like Vizzini, if you thought this was a game of chicken, you are going to seriously miscalculate what's going to happen. The worst outcome for the political parties is not that neither backs down. The worst outcome for them is backing down or compromising when the other doesn't. This game is actually called the prisoner's dilemma, and this kind of game is actually much more common in politics than chicken. Now, you might be thinking, phew, am I glad this is not a game of chicken? If it's chicken, there's a chance that both parties will do something really stupid and that we'll all lose. So if it's not chicken, we're all good, right? Right? Unfortunately for the American people, the prisoner's dilemma is much worse than chicken. In a game of chicken, there's actually a pretty good chance that one or both sides will back down. In the prisoner's dilemma, on the other hand, the most likely outcome is actually a crash. It's the worst outcome. I'll show you why that's the case in subsequent lectures, but the idea is actually pretty straightforward. If the worst outcome possible is backing down when the other doesn't back down, then going straight is always better than swerving. This is important and captures an idea called a dominant strategy. A dominant strategy is a strategy that is the best strategy for you to adopt no matter what the other player does. Let's look at this payoff matrix here for the prisoner's dilemma, which is slightly different than the one for the game of chicken. If they back down, what should you do? Well, if they back down, you're best off standing firm. That gives you your favorite outcome, so it's a no-brainer, right? If they're going to back down, you refuse to back down, and you win. But what should you do if they don't back down? Well, if they don't back down and you back down under the rules of the prisoner's dilemma and the payoffs we see here, then that gives you your worst outcome, right? You backing down and them winning and rubbing it in your face. That's the worst for you in this game, not the crash, right? So if they don't back down, then definitely don't back down. Your best option is still to stand firm. So standing firm, or in game theorists like to call it defecting, is always better, no matter what the other person does. If the other person backs down, stand firm. If the other person stands firm, stand firm. It's the dominant strategy. And that's what happened in 2013 and 2014 for a short time. Let's look. Yeah, in 2013 and 2014, government was briefly shut down. Workers were sent home without pay. Each party blamed the other, and the American people were worse off, probably as a whole. Why were they worse off? Well, because although the payoffs of this game for the parties look like a prisoner's dilemma, the payoffs for the American people actually look a lot more like the game of chicken. So if you think about it, the Republicans and Democrats were playing a game of the prisoner's dilemma with each other, but they really were playing a game of chicken when it came to the American people. Most Americans, after all, care a lot less about which party wins than making sure basic government services are running. Now, you might not believe that, and that's okay, but consider that about half of American voters don't bother showing up to vote, and about the same number, about half, identify with political parties. About 46% of Americans identify as independents, and that leaves about 3% of Americans who identify with minor parties. So that suggests that at the most, the health of a single party is only important to about 27% of the voting population, which is the Democratic Party. Um, so, and of course, this is not counting people who aren't eligible to vote. We don't know what they think. So this is a judgment call I'm making in classifying this as a prisoner's dilemma. But I think it's pretty solid. Of course, reality is a little bit more complex than this simple game. And I've made a lot of assumptions about everybody being more or less rational and everybody knowing what the other player prefers. If you start introducing uncertainty or asymmetric information, one person having more information than the other, you can get different results. Remember Vizzini, right? But at some level, if you understood that this was a prisoner's dilemma, you could have predicted the outcome, and you could have probably made some recommendations as to how to fix it. If, like many pundits, you thought it was a game of chicken, you probably were not as concerned. In a game of chicken, it's quite likely that one or both will swerve. Ironically, because many pundits weren't so concerned, that made the government shutdown a little bit more likely than if everybody had understood the situation correctly as a prisoner's dilemma. Because, of course, if people understood that it was a prisoner's dilemma, they would have been a lot more vocal and made a lot more effort to avoiding the shutdown. So, what should we have done to avoid this? Well, as a general rule, if you don't like the game you're playing, the best thing to do is switch to a different game. But how do you do that? To change the game, you have to change the payoffs to the player somehow. Make it more worthwhile to them to adopt a different strategy. And I think there's at least 3 different ways to do this. You can try to change the rules of the game. You can try to increase or decrease the number of players involved in the game. Or you can, as a player, try to make threats, promises, or commitments that change the payoff for the other player. In effect, you add not the number of players, but the number of options on the table. Let me give you an example of changing the rules. You could force Congress to pass a law making the outcome of a government shutdown very bad for each political party. For example, if the government shuts down, then you could have all sitting congressmen and the sitting president, no matter what side they were on of the issue, you could bar them from running for re-election. Or if the government shuts down, you could make it a law that the first salaries to stop being paid are the salaries that go to Congress, the president, and all their staffs. If you want to go nuclear, you could also freeze all of their bank accounts like we do with terrorists and Russian diplomats. Now, don't get me wrong. If Congress and the president and their staffs don't show up to work, nothing's going to get solved more quickly. But at the same time, it's probably never going to come to that because this kind of rule with this kind of payoff hurts those whose responsibility is to get things done the most. By making it much worse not to compromise, you make it extremely likely that they will come to a compromise. If you wanted to change the number of players involved, you could, for instance, just remove the decision from Congress and the president to the Federal Reserve and let them decide what the debt ceiling should be. Now, this idea is not very democratic. It introduces another player into the game, but it essentially removes debate from the political arena. And the Republicans and the Democrats will just simply have to act based on the constraint set by the Federal Reserve. Finally, another way to switch the game that you're playing is to, well, make some threats or promises or commitments if you're a player in the game. So, if you're President Obama, you could threaten to cut programs the Republicans love first when the shutdown occurs. This would put a lot of pressure on the Republican Party from their members to come to the bargaining table and back down. So President Obama could threaten to cut veterans benefits, close a couple army bases, and defund the Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA, and Republicans might decide to back down because standing firm now just got a whole lot less appealing. In effect, President Obama was able to unilaterally change the payoffs for the Republicans in this game. Now, at some point, my students usually say something like, well, why can't we all just get along and cooperate? Well, unfortunately, this problem lies at the heart of politics. Politics is about conflict and disagreement. If we didn't disagree, we wouldn't need elections to settle who should rule and what should be done. Competition is kind of embedded in the notion of politics. Even in dictatorships, there's competition, even though it's not out in the open. And in political competition, if one side wins, well, the other side often loses. So, chicken, the prisoner's dilemma, these are just some of the games that politicians, bureaucrats, corporations, and voters play with one another. These are strategic games. Each player, in his or her strategy, has to take into account what the other is likely to do. Now, these are also two-player games, symmetric games, and simultaneous games. So they're two-player games here. I've modeled this just Republicans versus President Obama, but there could be more players. They're simultaneous games because each player is faced with basically the same decision, back down or don't, and they also have to basically act at the same time without certain knowledge of what the other would do. So if one player had to move first, so if, for instance, it was legally mandated that Obama had to address the issue first, then Republicans could just tailor their strategy based on what President Obama did, and vice versa, if the rule went the other way. But of course, many games are neither two-player games, nor symmetric, nor simultaneous. Next time, we'll talk about what games our founding fathers were playing as they set up the Constitution, and we'll see that they were very shrewd strategic game players indeed.